In 1932, Ford launched its legendary V8 flathead engine. So how did Chevy answer? With its tried and true six-cylinder engine that sold better. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. You know, this is a great collection with more than 180 cars, some very new and modern, others from the early days, like this 1932 Chevrolet Series BA Confederate. And we'll talk more about this car in just a moment, but first, make sure you like and subscribe, and in the comments down below, let me know what I got right, and of course, what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong. And I want to know your stories about driving around in old cars. Have you ever owned something from the 1930s? Have you at least ridden in these? Did your family have one? All right, let's talk about this car. Well, the full name is the Chevrolet Series BA Confederate. Most people just called it the Chevy Confederate. It replaced the 1931 Series AE Independent, another long name. Of course, it came during the height of the Great Depression, when automobile sales across the industry were sharply declining. In 1931, Chevy sold 600,000 cars, but in 32, it was just 323,000. But even with that massive drop, Chevrolet was still America's best-selling brand that year. For 1932, Chevy offered the Confederate in a wide range of body styles, effectively giving buyers the look and feel of multiple models under just one nameplate. Fisher Body, of course, supplied 14 different body styles, which included two-door coupes like this one, two-door roadsters, four-door sedans, and Tourers, also other styles. You also had your choice of either standard or deluxe. The deluxe, well, they got more chrome trim on the hood vents and other goodies. Ads back then were really pushing low prices. They called it the Great American Value for 1932. They also proclaimed, though, that it had performance thrills that you never had out of a low-priced car. Of course, 1932 was the year Ford debuted its legendary flathead V8, and while it may have been revolutionary, it was not enough to beat Chevy. Ford sold 286,000 cars that year, but it was still number two. Even with that newfangled engine, it wasn't enough to topple the bow tie. Chevy made it clear that people didn't need an 8-cylinder. Ads talked about how you could save with 6 cylinders and that they cost less for gas, oil, and upkeep. They didn't even mention the Ford V8. They didn't have to. So what kept Chevy sailing along? Was it the styling that some people called the little Cadillac? Was it the smoother ride? Was it the rock-solid Stovebolt 6 engine? Well, probably all of the above. All right, let's walk around and take a look at the styling of our 1932 Chevrolet Confederate. And the first thing I want to talk about is this grille right here, because in the Chevrolet world for 1932, the grille itself was still very flat, right across there. In the Ford world for 1932, they were just beginning to implement that little V shape that, of course, would come to define the next few years. Chevrolet would get to that the following year, but for this year, it was still very flat. Having said that, they promoted the front end of this car quite a bit, and the reason being is the previous year, they only had a single bar going across like this. For 1932, they had 2 bars, and the purpose of that, as they promoted, was that it meant for a more stable front end. The headlights, which were mounted here, were on a firm mounting. The fenders, which were connected to this with these 2 bars, were firmer than what you were going to get the previous year. So they made it very clear that you had less rattle, less shake, you had stabilized front end, which was very important. Another big styling change that happened in 1932 are these vents on the side of the engine cowl. For 1931, they simply had louvers, which is exactly what 1932 had for Ford. For Chevrolet, they introduced a much more stylish look, which was more common on more expensive cars. If you had the deluxe version, you got chrome vents. If you bought the standard version of this car, then you just got the painted vents. Another subtle change also happened up here. Well, first off, right here on the cowl, they introduced this vent which would bring air into the cockpit, which was similar to what they did with Ford with 1932 as well. This windshield is a significant thing, and it's really hard to see, but it is very slightly tilted backward. It has just a little bit of an angle to it. getting a little more, can we dare call it, aerodynamic shape. Ford was doing exactly the same thing. Slowly but surely, they were reaching the point where they were going to tilt them back even further. And they accentuated it with this line right here that kind of came down and went forward. Not a lot of tilt, not a lot of angle to that windshield, but a pretty significant change in terms of the way they were looking at the design of the car. Up top, we have the fabric top. They won't come out with the GM turret top for another few years. It was really hard to press big pieces of steel that way, so as a result, they simply went with the fabric top for a long time. In the back, this is what we call a 5-window coupe. There's 5 windows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the other side. We don't count the windshield in front. 3-window coupes would have nothing back here, but when you were counting those windows, you would call this a 5-window coupe. This is not a rumble seat car, and you can tell that from the outside for 2 things. First off, there are no steps going up the fender, which is the thing that they would use to get in. Also, the handle for the trunk is right there. If it was a rumble seat, well, we'd have it at the top. Walking our way around, in addition to stabilizing the front, they also stabilized the frame. They had 5 new cross members going across to give a stronger frame, so it had, well, a greater foundation. Another significant thing to talk about with Chevrolet, which was really different than Ford, was the suspension, especially up front. You'll notice it has those what are called longitudinal semi-elliptical springs. These leaf springs right here going from front to back. Ford, and in fact, we just happen to have a Ford right next to it. This is a 1931 model, but the suspension is essentially the same. Notice that it's got that transverse bar going from one side to the other. All right, now what's the difference? Well, the result is that the Chevrolet would have a slightly more, smoother ride. The Ford, with that transverse mounted axle up front and the way it was sprung, had a bumpier ride. The result is that people who are buying Chevys felt that they had a nice, smooth ride wherever they were going. And that was a strong selling point compared to the Ford. And not quite as advanced in the Ford world, you could say, as they were in the Chevy world. Now, the advantage of this is it was simpler and easier to repair, less things to worry about, only 1 set of springs, which were, once again, mounted from side to side. This had 2 sets of springs over here. But if you were pitching the point that you wanted a comfortable ride, well, that's exactly what you were going to sell with this 1932 Chevy Confederate. Moment to talk about wire wheels and why they were used back then. A big reason, quite frankly, was weight. These are much lighter than the steel wheels, and they could still carry a pretty good load. The tension spoke design also added some flexibility that could absorb the road shocks from the uneven surfaces they were driving on. They also allowed for more air to get into the drum brakes, which kept them cooler. Wire wheels often used this center lock hub, similar to the Rudge Whitworth knockoff system that was introduced in the 1900s. That system allowed the wheels to be removed and installed much more quickly. That was useful not only in racing, but it was really handy in just about any daily driving if you had to change one of these. But there were also drawbacks to wire wheels. You had to keep each spoke adjusted and tensioned just right so the wheel didn't wobble. All the little nooks and crannies in there were susceptible to rust and corrosion. Plus, the wheels are simply more complex to build. As a result, car manufacturers eventually shifted away to the solid wheels. And the wire wheels, well, they just became a styled hubcap. The 1932 Chevy Confederate was powered by the solid Chevy Stovebolt inline 6 engine, a design that had become the backbone of Chevy cars since it was introduced in 1929. Now, this engine had 194 cubic inches, overhead valve, obviously 6 inline cylinders, and produced about 60 horsepower. Very reliable, solid performance, 0 to 35 in 6.7 seconds. Probably the biggest change in 1932 was the switch from an updraft carburetor mounted below the intake manifold to a downdraft carburetor mounted on top. Meant better airflow and fuel feed. This engine also got better lubrication and cooling systems, which made it slightly more refined than the previous year. Now, the inline 6 Stovebolt had been Chevy's signature engine, like I said, from 1929 on, and it was still popular because it was robust, it was simple to maintain, and it was inexpensive to produce. Its overhead valve design gave an edge over the flathead engines that a lot of competitors were using. And once again, it was efficient, smooth running. This basic engine, by the way, at Chevrolet had a really long run. They bumped it out to 216 cubic inches in 1937, 235 in 1941, and in one form or another, this engine ran all the way up to 1962, an amazing 33-year run before it was finally bumped off by the Turbo Thrift 6. As we step into our 1932 Chevrolet Confederate, I want you to think about what cars were like just a decade earlier, 1922. You know, the Model T. I mean, it was fine as a piece of transportation, but it didn't have a lot of creature comforts. By 1932, the car buying public was evolving. They were going from needs to wants. They wanted more. They wanted more comfort. They wanted more when they were driving a car. In fact, that's why Ford had to completely shut down its production line for months to switch over from the Model T to the Model A. People didn't want what the Model T, that utilitarian stuff, anymore. They wanted something more. And that's exactly what you were going to get if you bought this 1932 Chevrolet. The seat was now wider, had more cushioning, more support. It was simply a nicer, cleaner, more comfortable interior. You had roll-up windows. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not sure when roll-up windows became the norm. I know it started in about the late 20s. In fact, if you know the answer to that, please put it in the comments down below. But roll-up windows just made it a little more nice when you were driving your car. The interior, to be honest with you, wasn't a huge change from 1931. The instrument layout is pretty much the same. There is a little minor styling touch. In 1932, they go to these two dips right here, whereas in 1931, there was just a single dip in the center. Had a 3-speed synchronous transmission, which was new for 1932. Another thing that was new in 1932 was freewheeling. This button right here, you would push it in at a certain point, and the engine would basically coast, allowed you to save gas. Now, there were other cars that had it. It kind of came and went for a period of time, but Ford did not have it. So this was an important selling point above and beyond what Ford was offering. Chevrolet at this point was using, like most car companies, were using the standard 3-pedal configuration with the clutch on the left, brake in the center, the accelerator over on the right. I do know I've seen pictures of some Chevrolets from the 1910s which were using this configuration, so they may have been using it for almost 20 years. If you know the answer to that as well, please put that down in the comments down below. Just more creature comforts, in fact, more so than what Ford was offering. And I think that was a big selling point. You know, the insulated driver's compartment, the adjustable seat that Chevrolet had. It had a bigger dashboard, better instrumentation than what Ford was offering in 1932. And I think that's a really important reason that they were pitching the point that this was meeting the wants more so than the needs. Obviously, this is just a coupe, nothing in the back except a little place to store something. I do like the fact you were able to roll down the rear window, get a little more vent in here. If you were to bump up to the Deluxe from the Standard, you did get a little extra nicety, shall we say. Better materials for the seats, a little more chrome accents. But any way you look at it, the 1932 Chevrolet was just a step above the 1932 Ford in terms of those things that people wanted. 1932 was really the end of the line for this styling. For 1933, Chevrolet moved to an all-new body with the Series CA, originally called the Eagle, and the Master. It replaced the 32 Confederate. The 33 models had entirely new sheet metal, including really what was a more streamlined appearance. It had a V-shaped radiator, similar to what Ford was using in 1932, and other updated lines that gave the cars a smoother, longer profile than 32. In fact, the wheelbase was just slightly increased, which gave it a more substantial look and a better ride. Chevy's knee-bending independent front suspension arrived in 1934, followed by better braking and more aerodynamic styling. The car buyers loved it. Chevy sold more than 400,000 cars in 36 and 37. Now, in 32, Ford was selling reliability, but Chevy was telling its buyers that they should expect more. And this car right here, this 1932 Chevrolet Confederate, they said this was the place to get it.